And God said unto Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. That's a mystery there. Like, why that particular rite? Well, it's dramatic. I mean, it certainly affects a man where he's most concerned to be affected. There's something like that. And so it's a sacrifice that has a certain, I would say, a certain degree of unforgettability. That would be the first thing. And a certain degree of pain and threat that goes along with it. So it's not nothing. That's the thing. Now, you can argue, and I think there is an argument, a case to be made about whether or not in the modern world circumcision is is something reasonable to inflict on infants. I don't want to have that conversation at all. But I don't think that's relevant to this particular issue, because we're talking about something different. We're talking about humanity's attempt to reconcile themselves to the fact that something has to be given up in order for something else to happen, and to try to really work through that idea and to make it into a psychological reality. And so far what we've seen in the biblical stories is that when you make a sacrifice, it's not really something personal or psychological, right? It's something external and dramatic. You give up something that you own. You don't give up something that you are or that's part of you. And it's actually more of a sacrifice to give up something that's a part of you or something that you are than to give up something that you own. I mean, it's a subtle distinction because in some sense the distinction between what you own and what you are is subtle, right? I mean, it's not overwhelmingly subtle, but people identify with their possessions, and they need to, because otherwise they wouldn't care for them, and they need their possessions in order to live, so their possessions are in some sense integral to them. But this transformation here of an act that was external and associated essentially with possessions to something that was actually at least part of the body brings it much closer to the individual as a psychological reality. It's something like that. And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. It's also a permanent marker, you know, and I've read a fair bit about practices like tattooing and body scarification, you know, those are very, very common practices, right? They're human universals, actually. No matter where you go around the world, I mean, you see a couple of things. First of all, almost without exception, people wear clothing. And sometimes it's relatively minimal clothing, but often it's more decorative than protective, but it's almost inevitably clothing. And the other thing that you see is that people do scarify and tattoo themselves. And they do that in some manner to catalyze their identity, right? They're trying to transform themselves from a generic person in some sense to a person that's been designed by their own hand. It's something like that. It's a marker of developing identity, and some of it seems to be catalyzed with pain. You know, the modern people who tattoo, and I'm not saying that I'm in favor of tattooing, because actually I'm not, but that's my own particular bias, and if you have a tattoo, that's fine with me. I'm also not saying that there's anything wrong with it. But one of the things you do see, that people who have a tattoo do report, is a couple of things. Is that the pain is actually necessary, and that the pain is actually something that seems to establish something like a memory. So, well, it's a memory because of the pain, because you bloody well remember things that hurt. But it's also a memory because it's actually etched on you, right? It's not something that you can just abandon and forget. And so a circumcision is exactly the same thing. It's like you don't forget it because it's part of you. And so it makes a good token for a covenant. And so that seems to be the rationale here from speaking from a psychological perspective. It's to indicate as well that the damn thing that's happening is serious. And I think also that was the case with the earlier sacrifices of animals. So it's like, modern people don't do this. Like, you don't know how serious you would take a vow if you sacrificed a goat in your backyard. You know, it's actually a very dramatic thing to do. You know, you think about it as primitive, and perhaps it is archaic, and no doubt it is. But it's also to take the life of something and to spill its blood. That's no joke. That's something you remember, especially if you haven't done it before. And we actually don't know what we would need to do in order to take some things seriously. You know, because we all do things like make New Year's resolutions about how we're going to be better people, and we don't do it. And the reason for that, at least in part, is because we don't know how to make the sacrifice sufficiently bloody, let's say, so that we remember that it's necessary, right? We don't take it with seriousness. We don't think, I should quit smoking because I'm going to die. And we don't think through what that means, like coughing your lungs out for 3 months in a hotel bed while your entire family is like half repulsed and horrified and sorrow-stricken at the fact that this has happened far too early. You know, we won't make that real enough to make it serious. And without that seriousness, we won't do it. So there's something to be said for rituals of seriousness. And I think this is one of them. And he that is 8 days shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generations. He that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed. This is from Charles John Ellicott, who is Bishop of Gloucester. The fitness of circumcision to be a sign of entering into a covenant, and especially into one to which children were to be admitted, consisted in its being a representation of a new birth by putting off the old man and the dedication of the new man unto holiness. It's like a baptism. That's right. That's what's echoed there. And of course, baptism is a return to the pre-cosmogonic chaos, because that's what the water indicates, and a return to the source of life, and then the renewal that comes along with it. So it's a sacrificial idea in some sense, that if there's to be a new you, that the old you has to dissolve, has to return to the solution from which it emerged initially, and to reconstitute itself. And so there's an echo of that idea here. The flesh was cast away that the spirit might grow strong. And the change of name in Abram and Sarai was typical of this change of condition. They had been born again, and so must again be named. And though women could indeed be admitted directly into could not indeed be admitted directly into the covenant, yet they shared in its privileges by virtue of their consanguinity to the men who were as sponsors for them. And thus Sarai changes her name equally with her husband. Well, you could make a case, and anthropological observers have made this case too, that women undergo a set of sufficiently radical psychophysiological transformations merely as a consequence of being feminine in nature, such that the additional rituals of transformation that might be necessary for men aren't necessary. And one of those might be menstruation, because that's a pretty dramatic transformation. And there has been some indication that circumcision is like it's like the male equivalent of menstruation, something like that, because of the blood that's involved and because of the locale. And then, of course, the same thing is the case with women when they give birth, because that's a particularly dramatic thing, as I just witnessed, because my daughter just had a baby this week, so thank God for that. Recent investigation, this is from the Cambridge Bible for School and Colleges, which, if you want to read it, is only 58 volumes. Recent investigation has not tended to support the theory that circumcision has any connection with primitive child sacrifice, nor again that it took its origin from hygienic motives. Apparently it represents the dedication of the manhood of the people to God. In the history of Israel, it has survived as the symbol of the people belonging to Jehovah through his special election. This corporeal sacrament remained to the Israelite when every other tie of religion or race had been severed. The other thing that I read about in relationship to this idea of the multi-generational covenant had something to do, because God told Abraham to include all of the people of his household into this covenant. And that really meant that he was establishing a territory of ethics around them, like the ark, except the psychological equivalent of the ark, right? So it was a spiritual or psychological or ethical territory that everyone who was of that household was required to occupy, or obliged, or perhaps privileged to occupy. And there was also an injunction to Abraham with regards to his children, which was that as he had established a covenant with God, which we could say is something like his decision to aim as high as possible and to live properly as a consequence. It's more than that, but it's something like that. That he also was under the supreme moral obligation to share that with the other men in his family, especially his children. And so I think there's also a call here to adopting the sacred responsibility in relationship to children that has to do with ensuring that they understand how to take their place in the world. And I think that that's definitely something very much worth considering, especially given the emphasis in the Noah story, in the story of Noah, that Noah had that his generations were perfect, right? As I said before, it wasn't merely that he had walked with God, that he had perfected his own relationship with the divine, let's say, with the transcendent. And I want to make that concrete, which is a strange thing to do with the transcendent. I mean,